Discover, this is Daniela.
Hi, it's Jennifer Coolidge. I just want to thank you for making me feel so special. I earned cash back on debit for my dinner party groceries.
That's great. But with Discover Cashback Debit, we give everyone cash back on everyday purchases. Anything else I can help you with?
Do you like asparagus and mushroom sorbet? I've got leftovers.
Introducing Discover Cashback Debit, a checking account with cash back. It pays to Discover. Eligibility and terms at discover.com/cashback debit. Discover Bank, member FDIC.
The three men apparently arrived at Tel Aviv Airport on an Air France plane. Eyewitnesses say the men waited with the other passengers at the luggage conveyor belt inside the customs hall. When their luggage arrived, they took Kalashnikov automatic rifles and hand grenades from their suitcases and opened fire indiscriminately at everyone in their vicinity.
My name is Richard Dix, and this is How Did That Happen? A podcast where I look at everyday things or events and try to figure out how they came to be. Every week I will research one topic, and by the end of the episode, I hope to truly have the answer to the question, how did that happen? All right, welcome back to another episode of How Did That Happen? I am your host, Richard Dix, and this, of course, is the podcast where we find out how things happen, try to break things down to their foundation to figure out how they came to be. The topic that we have this week is the Israel-Hamas conflict. This is, of course, the third installment of that series. We're really trying to figure out, how it really happened. We've taken it all the way back to the Ottoman Empire, even a little bit before that. We brought it up to now about the 60s. We are going to start right around there and move all the way up till about the 90s in this episode. We're going to cover that, and the next one will be the 90s into the 2000s, and kind of so on and so forth. I think it's going pretty well. I think that this has been informative for me, and I think I'd like to hope that whoever is finding this is that it's adding a little bit of more color to the palette when you watch however other types of media you consume, whether it be CNN, NBC, Fox News, Al Jazeera, the Washington Post, whatever it is. I hope this can kind of just add to give you a little bit more information. And of course, always before we get to the nitty gritty, we have to talk about what was I watching? What have I watched? I just watched Good Burger 2, Part 2. Just watched the sequel. It was the best way I can describe it is it was a fever dream, and I mean that in a good way. I feel like they took whatever the crazy antics they had in the first movie and just took it up to 11, multiplied it by itself like times 10. You know what I mean? Like it's because I feel like the first movie was crazy. Like it was out there. It was wild. You know what I mean? Mondo Burger, all that stuff, and Good Burger, kind of take your order, and like cars that look like sandwiches and everything. But this just jumped it up. I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler alert to say Kel has kids. Or not Kel. Is it Kel? No, what's his name in there? I can't remember. Dang. But yeah, the Kel character has kids. He has like 5-6 kids. And actually, one of the kids is the guy who plays Kevin on The Shy, which, it's a little bit of a stretch for him, but he finds his way in that character. He does. But good. I would recommend it if you like the first one. If you like the first one, or if you like silly movies, because this movie is silly. I mean, it does, and you need that sometimes. I think especially times right now when things are so serious, you definitely need something where you're just like, oh, that's just plain old wacky. But it was good. It was good. So what am I listening to? Always just the same stuff. It's a lot of Tim Dillon, a lot of Bertcast, a lot of Chrissy Chaos, Hey Babe, stuff like that. Taste Buds. That's kind of where I'm sitting at. If you're ever wondering where my brain's at on a week-to-week basis when I listen to podcasts, that's kind of where I'm sitting at. I do a lot of do the sleep meditation podcast too. Those can help you out when you're in a pinch. Been trying to get some stuff done over there on the TikTok. Things have been going pretty well with that. Of course, that's at HTTHappen22. All the other socials are at HTTHappen. Of course, HTTHappen.com is the website. I've been kind of trying to work on that as well. We have a videos page there now. I know it's pretty primitive if you've been there, but I'm just trying to find a way to get the stuff that's on TikTok to also be on the website for people who may not go to TikTok and other social media places like that. But we're going to continue to expand that as time goes on. Our most recent bite-sized bio is out now. Of course, it was on MLK. I thought it would be fitting to go ahead and finish up and kind of add him on since we did his assassination the week before. Go ahead and do MLK. We learned a lot about him. Learned that he, went to 3 different schools in 3 different states to get all of his schooling before he went on to become an actual preacher. Learned that he had fallen in love with a white woman named Betty Moitz while he was studying at seminary in Pennsylvania, but knew that that was never going to work, so he ended up kind of ditching that for Coretta a couple years later in Boston. Check out those bite-sized bios. Every other Monday, we cover somebody from history, and I've been trying now for the last, I would say, at least the last 10 or so to make them go with the series that we're doing. So all the people that we've been covering now for at least the last couple months have been prominent figures in the 40s to 70s. And it won't always be like that, because once we get out of this series, they'll kind of go back and be, something else. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy that. Let's see if there's anything else to say before we get on with the episode. I don't think so. Of course, what we heard, the first thing that we heard when the podcast started was the kind of the news report from the Lod Airport Massacre, which we're going to get into later on in the podcast, but I just wanted to kind of mention that. If you guys are wondering what that was, it was gruesome. We have recordings of interviews of people who were there, and they are going to talk about some tales. I guess I will say that if you are squeamish in any way, you may want to skip certain parts, especially when we talk about the Lod Airport Massacre, because we do have some pretty gruesome details there. The goal here is never to be, like disgusting or disrespectful in any way with any of this stuff. So if you just know that that's where our focus is coming from. That's where the heart is. But there definitely will be some talk about body parts and blood that maybe is not for everybody. But yeah, I think that's about it. As always, give us 5 stars wherever you find this. If you liked it, 2 stars if you didn't like it. Tell us why you didn't like it, because constructive criticism is always welcome. Without further ado, as we know to do, here is the episode.
It is an all-out war. That's how Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan describes an invasion of the Golan Heights and the east bank of the Suez by Syria and Egypt.
Okay, so now that we're in part 3 of our Israel-Hamas conflict series, I guess you could say, we're now in a point, I would say that we're about in the 60s, about to head into the 70s. Yeah, we're about to head into the 70s. So it's important to kind of establish what's happening at this point now, because it's different than what it was 20 years ago or even 40 years ago, because so much has happened in that small amount of time. In just a span of 40 years, we've gone from Palestine being, the British mandated Palestine all the way up to 1947, and then the UN issuing its partition plan, which of course the Arabs deny, and Israel, takes and becomes, Israel, and then they start taking as much land as they can, basically throughout this time, through these different wars that happen. The next 3 Arab-Israeli wars, which of course is what we covered on the last episode. If you haven't actually heard that, you may want to go back and check that out, because we're going to start, like I said, right around the late 60s. And so this is now, like, Israel has become a participating power in the world, if you will. They're considered an ally in the Cold War by the U.S. The U.S. has been supplying them with military assistance since about the 60s. During this time, U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger believed that the regional balance of power hinged on maintaining Israel as a military dominance in that area, because they saw, I guess, because the way that the Soviets were funding the Arab nations, they thought, in the same way with the Iron Curtain, if we have to keep kind of a guy in that region that we like and that has our ideals, our best interests at heart, that's kind of, I think, how one of the ways that America and Israel's partnership kind of blossoms or begins to blossom in the mid to late 60s. And so what you find, and what really what's really important to establish as we go forward over the next 50 years really is to talk about the different groups that are established and do the kind of the bidding, going back and forth on behalf of these different nations. Now, I think for Israel it's pretty simple. It's just the country of Israel. But as far as the Arab nations, as far as Palestine is involved, there's a few different ones, and I personally never fully understood. And to be honest with you, I probably still don't now, but I have a better idea now than I ever have, and I'll try to explain it to you a little bit as we go forward, because these are the people that we'll see, like I said, are kind of the movers and shakers of the Arab Israeli conflict over the next 30 to 40 years. And so it starts really with the Arab national movement, right? And this is kind of the beginnings of the PLO. And because what happens is, once Israel is established, and we kind of mentioned it, I think, in the last one, but a little bit, like, the Arab nations kind of come together a little bit and feel like they need to kind of, I mean, I guess like the title says, having nationalist movement in which Arabs are seen as kind of like a one mass, like one people, one nation. Even though they are like a multitude of nations, they kind of wanted to come together and hope that them coming together would find some way to help Palestine regain their independence and their liberation. And so that starts in the 50s with a man named George.Hamas, right, at the American University of Beirut. And so because he thought that the reclaiming of Palestine was a community effort, he really wanted to get out the idea of a united Arab identity. He thought that was crucial to them actually ever being able to take back their land. So this becomes, the best way you can think of it is it's a movement in every Arab nation to kind of become one, right? And that sounds great in theory, and it is almost a Zionist kind of like idea, I think. I'm just kidding. That's what I thought when I was reading it, but it's not fully. But the problem is, like with most things we've talked about, like when we talked about things like the Roman Empire, different stuff like that, it's hard to have a large collective be together and on the same page all the time, right? And that's really what happens with this, is that after a few years, it starts to fall apart. All of the different ones, they start as the Arab National Movement, and they fall apart and become these different little kind of regimes and factions in all these different nations. And what's interesting is you can look at the different governments that are run in places like Jordan or Syria, right, or Afghanistan and Iraq, and some of those governments link, at least probably 75% of them link back to the Arab National Movement as kind of their focus, or as kind of their basis for where they began. They've changed names and maybe changed the way they view things in certain cases, but the group itself a lot of them go back to the specific type of gathering that they were having. And that's interesting, is why it's important, because once you have that, the Palestinian version of that becomes the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, right? That was initially the Palestinian version of the Arab National Movement. All right, and that's important because they joined the PLO. The PLO becomes what's the main fighter for the Palestinians over the next kind of 30 to 40 years, right? But we're the Arab National Movement, that goes to the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and then they join the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1968. And this is where I was trying to kind of draw the connections for myself as well, because I've always been seen on TV as a kid growing up, this guy named Yasser Arafat, right? I've always seen him as like one of the Middle Eastern voices you see when you watch Fox News, you watch CNN, any of that stuff, right? And I couldn't figure out what his role was in the world. What I also thought was odd, I'm just being completely honest, as an American kid watching on TV, I was like, why don't they hate him as much as they hate Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden? Like, I'm trying to understand like geopolitics at like 12, 13 years old or whatever. And I don't know, there was a lot of things that were kind of explained to me. But so I say that to say Yasser Arafat was part of the PLO, but he was part of a different faction of the PLO called the Fatah, right? So the Fatah and the PFLP are the two of the largest factions within the PLO. It's a bunch of different movements similar to the Arab National Movement, except it's a little more focused, specifically on the liberation of Palestine. And so this is all in the 60s. I say all of this to say, these are the people who, over the next 20 years, will enact some, it's hard to, maybe you call them massacres, definitely some terrorist attacks, all in the name of liberating Palestine. There were such things as the Lod Airport Massacre, right, which happened in 1972.
Suddenly, I heard a banging sound. We all looked at each other thinking, what is this noise? And suddenly, these huge panes of glass shattered. They came cascading down, and I watched them. And I remember thinking, this looks just like rain. It looks like raindrops. And then people started falling to the floor. And there is blood everywhere. It's everywhere, very quickly. And it suddenly occurred to me that this was something so awful. People trying to kill us.
3 members of the Japanese Red Army that were recruited by the PFLP, right, attacked Lod Airport, which was in Tel Aviv. And Lod Airport is now Ben Gurion International Airport. So if you've ever heard of that, it's like one of the main airports in Israel. It was attacked. 26 people were killed, and 80 others were injured.
I turned to run, and as I turned, this huge hole appeared in the back of my thigh. and I realised I had been shot. I ran and I went to hide under a chair. And you know what chairs are like at airports? They're really low. I have no idea how I got under there. It must have been adrenaline, I suppose.
At 10 p.m., the attackers arrived at the airport aboard an Air France flight from Rome. Dressed conservatively and carrying slim violin cases, they attracted little attention. As they entered the waiting area, they opened up their violin cases and extracted Czech VZ-58 assault rifles with buttstocks removed. They began to fire indiscriminately at the airport staff and visitors, just mowing people down, which included a group of pilgrims from Puerto Rico and tossed grenades as they changed magazines. So these guys just walk into an airport with violin cases. Well, they get off of a plane with violin cases, open the violin cases, they have machine guns, and they just start killing people.
And then there was a soldier standing next to me. I remember that because I couldn't get out of this chair. I was stuck. He pulled me out. And I remember smelling cordite, and the man next to me was dead. And he had no face. His face had been blown off, and his head was resting in his wife's lap. I know it was his wife. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, just a look of utter incomprehension. And I felt she was thinking, well, if you'd been standing here, you would have been dead. And if my husband had been standing where you were, he would have been alive.
These are Japanese guys from the Japanese Red Army. The Japanese Red Army was basically a kind of I think they were called a new leftist, kind of a neo-leftist group that was trying to overthrow the Japanese government. They actually were around for like 20, 30 years and did some damage. I mean, this was probably their worst that they did. But three guys, and this wasn't specifically the JRA. This was actually the PFLP that was enlisting the JRA to do this stuff. I know it's kind of hard to follow, but that's what happened. And they ended up killing, like I said, 26 people. I think one of them got shot. Yeah, and so that was 72, and also in 1972 was the Munich Massacre, which this is just...
This is an ITN newsflash from the Olympic Village in Munich, where early this morning armed Palestinian guerrillas raided the sleeping quarters of the Israeli team. The gunmen shot dead 2 Israelis and are now holding 20 athletes and 6 officials as hostages.
I've always heard about Munich. As someone who grew up in I guess the era, I think a little bit afterwards, people just talked about it as not like a 9/11, but something that you talk about, like the Challenger or stuff like that. It was just around. I never knew really what it was, and I did some research about it. And this also, like I said, this is why I mentioned the PLO and the PFLP. This is what this was about. I didn't know that.
Between 4 and 5 o'clock this morning, a group of Arab Palestinian terrorists rushed inside the building, killed the coach of our wrestlers, Moshe Weinberg, and took as hostages some of our sportsmen. Afterwards, they gave an ultimatum that until 12 o'clock today, some of the Arabic terrorists who are held in prison in Israel must be released, otherwise are going to kill some of the sportsmen who are staying there in their hands.
Let's see, how can I put this? The Palestinians came in and kidnapped like 11 Israeli Olympians at the Olympics in the Olympic Village. Now, what's crazy to me, and I watched a great documentary on it. I definitely recommend it to you. It's called One Day in September. It's actually free on Pluto TV. I think if you can rent it on Amazon. It's crazy, but if you just go to Pluto TV, it's completely free. But when this happens, once these guys get taken hostage and they all get murdered at the end, spoiler alert. But while this is happening, the Olympics are still going on. Like the IOC will not actually stop. Well, they ended up stopping it at some point, but for the first few days, this is still like they're still doing shot put or whatever, just like doing the Olympics. It's crazy. All of the hostages, and I think most of the guys who were holding them hostage actually get killed. 3 of them survive. Right, they survived. They never actually ended up standing trial. Because, and we find out later, this is actually what happened, but what would happen is a flight would get hijacked about a month later. And the conditions that those guys wanted when they hijacked the plane was to have the 3 guys released who had taken part in the Munich Massacre, right? And so basically Germany, they abide. They give up the guys without consulting really anybody internationally or specifically Israel or anybody. They didn't talk to anybody. They just gave up the prisoners. And we find out later, years later, years later that this was all just a ruse. This was all fake and orchestrated by the German government as a way to kind of wash their hands of the situation. Like they created a situation in which they could give back the Palestinian terrorists back to Palestine without having to actually ever really deal with it. Now, this wouldn't come out for at least, I think, like 15 or 20 years, if not more than that. But I just thought that was crazy. I mean, and this is, I don't know, just yet another, I guess, little tick mark in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And we go from there to those things that happened then, and that's the early 70s to right about 74, where we'll get to what is called the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, and it's sometimes called the Yom Kippur War. The main thing that I can draw from it, well, first off, let's talk about what Yom Kippur is, because I think that's just, it's called, the Day of Atonement. It's one of the holiest days in Judeo, or in Judaism. It occurs annually in late September, early October. I don't know if it's specifically when they did it this time, but it's, do you think it's a coincidence that the October 7th, the Hamas conflict started around that time? I think these guys don't forget, everything is done with purpose. Like they said, they planned this Israel-Hamas conflict, the current one, for like 2 years before they even did it. So I don't think it was a coincidence. But so we go back to the Yom Kippur War, right?
Discover, this is Daniela.
Hi, it's Jennifer Coolidge. I just want to thank you for making me feel so special. I earned cash back on debit for my dinner party groceries.
That's great. But with Discover Cashback Debit, we give everyone cash back on everyday purchases. Anything else I can help you with?
Do you like asparagus and mushroom sorbet? I've got leftovers.
Introducing Discover Cashback Debit, a checking account with cash back. It pays to Discover. Eligibility and terms at discover.com/cashback debit. Discover Bank, member FDIC.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
The Fourth Arab-Israeli War, which happened, in 1973, not 1974. It was in 1973, from October the 6th to October the 25th. And, of course, it was between Israel and a coalition of Arab states that was led primarily by Egypt and Syria. Most of the fighting took place in the Sinai Peninsula as well as the Golan Heights, both of which had been occupied by Israel since 1967. Some things happened in Africa as well. In addition, northern Israel was also a place where some battles happened. And this is interesting because I didn't realize that this was also one of the proxy wars of the Cold War as well. This is what you would find, and that's why I think all this stuff kind of goes hand in hand when you look at it. Like once this war broke out, or not even say once, as this war was breaking out, both sides of the Cold War, America and Russia kind of picked sides and started to fund the same way that we're doing now, the same way that we're doing in the Ukraine right now. We fund one side funds the other. But they fight for about 2 weeks, about 3 weeks. They end up having a ceasefire. And what's interesting about what happens right after that is the ceasefire leads to what's called the creation of the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force. That's a mouthful. UNDOF, if you're going to say the acronym, UNDOF. And this is still active now, right? This turns out to be one of the longest standing agreement by Israel and an Arab nation in the history of their existence as a nation. It's because it's still happening now. What really happened is the UN came in and provided an international coalition of soldiers who were tasked with keeping the peace between Syria and Israel. And they just kind of switch out guys I think it's every couple of years. And it's literally just people from like soldier regiments from all over the world. We're talking Finland, Austria, Italy, India, the Philippines, Canada, and they've just been sitting there in kind of Ireland, Uruguay, Ghana, Czech Republic. I mean, these international soldiers that come in and kind of keep the peace between Israel and Syria and this little space that's between them. But that's kind of that's essentially how that war ended. I say that's really how the Fourth Arab-Israeli War ended. We're in 74 now, but yeah, it's just I don't know. I thought that was wild. People have actually died in the Yundaf. Is that what you was that how we would say it? I guess. Canada, I think, has had the largest loss of life over this time. I think they lost like 5 people because I think a plane or a helicopter was shot down. And so, yeah, I mean, the 70s were a very, very tumultuous time for this conflict. Overall, I mean, just as much as the 60s and the 50s before them, it just never really stopped, and it never really does, as we see. That will bring us into, I'm going to mispronounce this, but what is it? The Entebbe, I'm going to ENTEBBE raid, right? It's happened in 1976. Also called Operation Thunderbolt, like that way better, way easier to pronounce. Also retroactively called Operation Yonatan. I don't know what that is, why they do that, but it was the 1976 Israeli counter-terrorist mission in Uganda. So what happens is another plane gets hijacked. Once again, it's Air France. I saw this and I was like, Air France gets hijacked multiple times out of Tel Aviv. Like, if this was the 70s and it was me, I'm not catching a plane on Air France anywhere. So the plane gets hijacked by some people of the PFLP and 2 German RZ terrorists. They divert the flight, which was, I think, going to, was it going to Athens? Yeah, no, they stopped in Athens. I think they were going to Paris. But they diverted the flight and then took them to Uganda, right? And when they got to Uganda, the dictator of Uganda was like sympathetic to the cause, basically, of the Palestinians. So he kind of welcomed them with open arms, sent out soldiers to meet the plane. They ended up separating all the passengers. All the non-Israeli passengers ended up getting sent on to Paris. And then they left the rest of the Israeli ones. I think it was something like 100 or so people that were left. This is when the raid actually happens. This is when the Israelis come back for their people, and they go to Uganda and they kind of overrun the terminal and end up killing all of the hijackers and get everybody back, except for a few people die. I think like 3 or 4 of the actual hostages do die during this actual raid, but the rest of them, live. So that's a pretty much a success. And I'm telling you all this stuff just so you can kind of see what happens over the time, because I think you can. I've heard even now more people talk about the different conflicts that have happened, or the different wars that have happened in this conflict in the last 50 to 60 years. But I don't think they talk about some of the terrorist acts that actually happened outside of the wars. You know what I mean? Like, this is not the actual one of the Arab-Israeli wars. This is just some violence that's happening outside of that. And I think it's important to mention that as well. That's 76. 1978 brings us the famous Camp David Accords, which, of course, with President Jimmy Carter, the leader of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. I couldn't spell it when I heard it, and I can barely read it when I see it. It's such a hard name to pronounce, in my opinion. But yeah, this is when they come together here.
Hard issues to be settled. The questions that have brought warfare and bitterness to the Middle East for the last 30 years will not be settled overnight. But we should all recognize the substantial achievements that have been made. One of the agreements that President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin are signing tonight is entitled A Framework for Peace in the Middle East. Basically, but the Jimmy Carter plays the go-between between these two leaders, and they draft 2 dual accord documents in a secretive 12-day process where they kind of go back and forth. And I watched the signing I guess, ceremony of this entire thing, and these guys, they can't help but to just be so proud of themselves, And I mean, it's really, obviously hindsight's 20/20, but it's so sad to look at it because they're just like, we, peace in the Middle East, and we're all like all these symbolic applause breaks, and everyone's clapping at each other, and everyone's so happy, and it's just like, okay, well, nothing's really going to get solved because they'll continue to fight for the next 50 years. So in the Camp David Accords, Israel agreed to give the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, and in return, Egypt would allow Israel to trade in the Suez Canal. Egypt would also agree to recognize Israel as a country. This would begin kind of the succession of Arab countries starting to recognize Israel as a country, and would kind of start to mark the shift from this entire conflict going from the Arab-Israeli conflict to more of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is a pretty interesting and important distinction to make, because what we see when Israel first declares its independence is that this is basically a war
it's Israel against everybody. You know what I mean? It's Israel against everybody else in that whole area. Everybody's up in arms about the fact that Israel is now a country, right? That's what happens for 30 years. Here we are 30 years later, and some of these Arab countries are finally starting to come around and say, okay, well, finally, I guess we can, all right, you're a country. I see you. Okay, I see you. You know, it's kind of what's happening, which, you know, it's a pretty big deal. And, of course, the world thought so because they gave these guys the Nobel Peace Prize for this. Specifically Sadat and Monacan, you know, the Prime Minister of Israel. They got the Nobel Peace Prize. What's sad is Anwar Sadat would get murdered like 3 years after this. I think in 1981, he was murdered by a religious extremist. So, I don't know. It's these guys. It's hardly ever a good end for these guys. All right, and so that's going to bring us to the creation of Hamas.
Hamas gets its name from an Arab acronym, Harkat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which translates to the Islamic Resistance Movement. Which
I was obviously very curious about, and will be completely honest and say that I don't think I've ever really heard of them until this happened. I was aware. I think I mentioned that. I think in the first episode of this series, that I knew about the Israel and Palestine conflict. I knew even about Yasser Arafat. I think I've heard of the PLO before, but I was not completely versed in like the current goings-on of what's happening over there. And really, Hamas is the most recent development of Palestinian resistance, if you will. And so it kind of like most things, even though, I mean, its real roots are in the 80s, and we're going to get there, but it all goes back to kind of the ideas of what happened in 1967. That really, and that's why I mentioned in the last episode of the series, that war is so important because it really does lay the groundwork for what people will be fighting for and be mad about for the rest of the time that we're alive, basically for the next 50 to 60 years. So after the war with Egypt in 67, right, Israel hunted down all the actual PLO factions that they have been fighting against, right, because that's who they have been war with, and they kind of, you know, ended that, and that was their main focus, right, was to fight it, was to try to in the same way they're trying to eradicate Hamas now, they're trying to do the same thing in the 70s with the PLO. And so what happened when that was going on, there was a man named Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, right, who kind of came on the scene, right, and he was kind of running it from a more religious aspect, a more religious approach, as, you know, he initially opened up what do they call it, an Islamist group called Mujama al-Islamiyya, and definitely not, you know, how that is pronounced. And so because these groups were different than the PLO, Israel kind of turned a blind eye, or even actually kind of encouraged their development. They try to bolster their existence because they saw this as an alternative to the PLO. They thought that these guys are nicer, more religious based. These nice religious men, they wouldn't do anything to us, kind of thing, right? So they allowed them to grow. They allowed them to build mosques and clubs and schools and libraries and stuff in Gaza, right? This is in 1979. And it must be mentioned, I think, just to show, you know, how, I don't know, I was flat out impressed. Like, I'm not even gonna lie, just a little bit, that the guy who made this, the Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, dude did all this, and he's a quadriplegic from a wheelchair. This man broke his neck when he was a kid, at like a beach accident or something, and was always in a wheelchair. And what went on was very smart. He went on to be a teacher. The same high school they said that he went to school at. But he was the leader, and he did all of this. I believe it was a quadriplegic, definitely not at least a paraplegic, but I don't think he could work his top half either because he broke his neck. But yeah, he did all this from a wheelchair. And so basically, he, as the time goes on, you know, we get into the 80s, and he's eventually starting to, I guess, becomes a part of the real resistance. They start to gather weapons. They start to go against the Israelis. The word gets out that this is happening. The Israelis then raid one of his mosques and find a cache of weapons. They put him in jail, and this is kind of when he first really comes on the scene as a true adversary to the Israeli government. And it's a pretty turn of events for the Israeli government, because they had actually given money to Hamas in their early days, because, like I said, the idea was to kind of, you know, if we can fund this side of the Palestinian resistance, which we seem to like a little bit more than the other side, we can maybe pit the two against each other, and kind of whatever we give to them makes the PLO a little bit weaker. And of course, the PLO is run by Yasser Arafat, and then Hamas is run by Yassin. Now, it's another interesting distinction to make between the two of them. While they both want Palestinian liberation, the PLO at the very least does it. I believe they recognize Israel as a nation, but Hamas does not. Hamas is not interested in a two-state solution. That doesn't seem to be what they're actually ever seem to be after. They want to basically reclaim every single piece of every acre of land that was ever considered to be Palestinian, whereas the PLO is open to the idea of a two-state solution, which is why even now they still actually run the West Bank, or the party, the Fatah party runs the West Bank, because they're willing to work with the Israelis. We're now into the 80s and the 90s here. We're going to stop really, because part 4 is going to pick up with the Oslo Accords and what kind of happens with that going forward. I do want to mention, because we're talking about the creation of Hamas, I think, because this is important to why I think they're still so galvanized, is the leader, Yassin, was blown up in an airstrike on his way to church in 2004. And I don't think, like I said, people don't forget. People, whether we believe that their cause is just or not, their leader was killed by their enemy. And so it just continues to be, fuel for the fire, and makes them feel like their cause is even more just. It's the idea of the person that you think is bad doing bad stuff. If you already think the person is bad and they do more bad, it's just, it doubles down. You can only believe that they, are only bad. But yeah, so he gets gunned down by some missiles on the way to a mosque in 2004, and that, I don't want to get too deep into it, because we're going to cover it in the next episode. But I mean, that I think after that, you really do kind of see Hamas have a rise to power that would end up, I guess, as we know, foreshadowing, be pretty bad for the Israeli people. But yeah, I don't think there's much else to talk about for this particular episode. I wanted to get the main thing I wanted to get on the record, I guess, for this episode was to talk about the different kind of factions and parties that were really kind of doing things during the 70s and 80s, because I feel like you just get lost in the idea of talking about Arabs, Israelis, or whatever, yada yada yada. Like who is actually doing this? Who is the PLO? Because the PLO is still around now. Who are the Fatahs, right? And Yasser Arafat, like I said, that was a big thing for me to try to understand. And even when because I did the research on Hamas. This was happening probably right after October the 7th. I just wanted to know, who are they and where they came from. I never really, like I said, heard of them, and to find out that they have been around for almost 40 years now. And in certain capacities are a functioning government. It just depends on who you are in the world as to whether or not you recognize them as a government or a terrorist organization. But it's good to know this stuff. It's good to understand, like I said. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about the 90s into the 2000s, and then I think we will do the episode after that. We'll finally get to what is currently happening in the Israel-Hamas conflict over there. But I think that is about it. All right, so that was the third installment of the Israel-Hamas conflict. We are chugging right along, learning so much. I would say, like I said, one of the bigger things for me, the takeaway that I learned with this episode, is I knew about Munich, right? But I didn't know that it had anything to do with, the Palestinian and Israel issues that they have over there. I did not know that at all. What was interesting also, I didn't mention in the podcast, is initially when the reports came back about what happened, they said that all the hostages had survived, and it was only after, not sure how long it was, at least a few hours, if not maybe a little bit longer, that they came back and said, no, actually none of them survived. Everybody died except for the three guys, the three captors. But also, what was, I think, the more remarkable thing about that entire process is that they did not stop the Olympics initially. And there's great video. Like I would say, go check out that documentary, One Day in September. It's free on Pluto TV, and they have all the footage, and you can literally see. That's what makes it so crazy. You can literally see on one side there's the Olympic Village where the Israelis are being held hostage. There's a guy, gun, holding people hostage. Over the wall, right? Look over there, just life going on. Looks like the most fun you ever seen anybody have in their entire life. It's the Olympics, right? International mingling, all that good stuff. But it's just the juxtaposition, the fact that it's truly happened. It was something you would see in a movie. You think they're making this up. Like, why wouldn't you? How can you compete when people have already been murdered? First off, in this timeline, if we're going about with the timeline of how this happened, already 2 people have already been killed when they're like, well, we got the shot put at 1 o'clock, so we can't really. We gotta finish that one up. Then we'll talk about it. I don't know. It's crazy. But all this stuff, when you talk about it, that's why I feel like this podcast is not just this one particularly, but the reason we do this is interesting because you dig beneath the headline stories, you dig beneath what just the talking points they gloss over on CNN, and we really go into these things and talk about them. It's worth it. And like I said, it's also they talk about just the wars, and I think maybe it becomes a shorthand for people who lived it. If you were alive in the 70s and the 80s and coherent, relatively in the 90s. I mean, I was young, but not really, around mentally because I was a kid. But you would know this stuff already happened. But if you don't really understand why people are so steadfast in their convictions. This definitely helps. But yeah, we definitely got another part 4 coming, We got a part 5 at least. Then we're gonna kind of figure out where we go from there, because I figure by part 5 in the timeline will be up to the actual current times. So we'll kind of figure out where we go from there as far as if we continue to cover it. I'm really not sure, but we're going to talk about the 90s and 2000s in part 4. I don't think there's much else to say. As always, guys, HTT happened for everything. I will play you guys out a little bit more of that woman who was speaking about the Lod Airport Massacre, just because I feel like her words were so gripping. Like I listened to that interview a couple times, and you're just hearing a woman who is just so she is trying to reconcile. She's trying to make sense of what she saw and what she experienced. Even in this now, I think this interview has probably happened, I think, at least 5 to 10 years after it. And she just still kind of can't get it together. But yeah, so HTT Happen for everything. HTThappen.com, at HTT Happen for all the socials, HTT Happen 22 for the TikTok. Give us 5 stars wherever you find this, guys. If you loved it, 2 stars if you didn't love it. Tell us why you didn't love it, because constructive criticism is always welcome. As always, I appreciate you guys for coming back week to week and press and play. Always do appreciate that. And yeah, I'll see you next week with the next bite-sized bio.
The woman next to me was Puerto Rican, and she was pregnant, clearly. She kept asking where her husband was, and the doctors were saying to each other, who met, which means he's dead. And I was listening to this, and I thought, I hope she doesn't ask me anything. But of course, the doctors then left her, and she turned to me and she said, they can't find my husband. Do you think he's all right? And she looked at me very searchingly, and I thought, what can I say to her? So I lied, and I said that it was all chaotic, and that I'm sure that, very soon that she would know what had happened. And she said, oh, thank you. And then I remember I turned away so that she couldn't see my face. And I remember thinking, this is so awful.
With the Lucky Land Slots, you can get lucky just about anywhere.
This is your captain speaking. We've got clear runway and the weather's fine, but we're just going to circle up here a while and get lucky. No, nothing like that. It's just these cash prizes add up quick. So I suggest you sit back, keep your tray table upright, and start getting lucky.
Play for free at LuckyLandSlots.com. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+ terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.